Greetings, young true believers. So today we're going to talk about Amie Thomasson's fictional characters as abstract artifacts, and this is taken from her 1999 book, Fiction and Metaphysics. So uh, Thomasson, off the bat, wants to change up the order of things. She states that she does not want to pound square pegs into round holes, if you will, right? She's not taking a ready-made ontology and trying to fit fictional characters into it somehow. So before we go any further, let's just take a minute and talk about ontology. Ontology is a branch of metaphysics, metaphysics being that branch of philosophy that deals with the ultimate nature of reality. Ontology specifically deals with what can be said to exist, right? So she's not, Thomasson's not taking a world that already exists and trying to shoehorn, if you will, fictional entities into it. Rather, her approach is, quote, I suggest that we begin by paying careful attention to our literary practices so that we can see what sorts of things would most closely correspond to them. I thus begin by discussing what sorts of entities our practices in reading and discussing works of fiction seem to commit us to. And I draw out what she calls the artifactual theory of fiction as a way of characterizing a sort of entity that seems best suited to do the job of fictional characters, right? So she, going on a little bit further, she tells us that she wants to think of fictional characters as created entities, right? And she asks, do they simply need to be created at some time by someone, or is the identity of a fictional character somehow tied to its particular origin in the work of a particular author or authors taking part in a particular literary tradition? Unexamined intuitions may provide no clear answer to this question, but our goal is to draw out a variety of fictional characters that corresponds as closely as possible to our practices in studying fictional characters. Such critical practices provide grounds for taking the latter view, that a particular fictional character not only has to be created, but is necessarily tied to its particular origin, right? So Gandalf had to be created and is tied to the world of, the fictional world of Middle Earth in this particular example. Going on a little bit further, Thomasson tells us, in this about on page 145 of your text, so it seems that if we wish to postulate fictional objects that correspond to our ordinary practices about identifying them, fictional characters should be considered entities that depend on the particular acts of their author or authors to bring them into existence. Naturally, the process of creating a particular character may be diffuse. It may be created by more than one author over a lengthy period of time, involving many participants in a storytelling tradition, and so on. But the fact that the process of creating a fictional character may be diffuse does not disrupt the general point that whatever the process of creation for a given character may be, for coming into existence, it depends on those particular creative acts, right? So Frankenstein might have its origins, the monster that is, right, in the initial work of Mary Shelley, but Frankenstein has a diffuse existence, as Thomasson would put it, over the course of multiple works, not just of literature, but of film, etc., by many authors, right? Characters, she tells us, depend on the creative acts of their authors in order to come into existence and depend on literary works in order to remain in existence, right? So even if Frankenstein, the original novel, all copies were to go out of existence, Frankenstein would still exist through its diffusion, right? Going on a little bit more, Thomasson tells us the dependence of a character on a literary work forces us to address a second question. If a character depends on a work of literature, what does a work of literature depend on? When can we say that a literary work exists? Because characters depend on literary works. Anything on which literary works depend is also ultimately resting or something on which characters depend. As ordinarily treated in critical discourse, a literary work is not an abstract sequence of words or concepts waiting to be discovered, but instead is the creation of a particular individual or group at a particular time in particular social and historical circumstances. Thus, as with characters, it seems that literary works must be created by an author or authors at a certain time in order to come into existence, right? Again, hence the world of Middle Earth, right? Now, how does Thomasson's view differ from the other competing competing theories of fictional entities? And this is a really interesting question that philosophers have variously treated, through at least the past century or more, right? For example, Bertrand Russell famously asked, "What is the present King of France?" in 1920, when there was no King of France, right? He famously stated that the present King of France is bald. The sentence is intelligible, but it's ultimately meaningless on Russell's view because it didn't refer. Well, Thomasson goes on to make reference to the psychological work of Alexius Meinong, a famous Austrian psychologist, right? And she notes that the most popular and well-developed theories of fiction that have been available are those broadly construable as Meinongian theories, including those that take fictional characters to be either non-existent or abstract entities, such as those developed by Parsons, Zalta, and Rappaport. Neither Meinong's theory nor contemporary Meinongian theories are devised specifically as theories of fiction. They concern a wider realm of non-existent objects generally. Again, like the present King of France in the Russell example, right? So what's characteristic of these? There's at least one object correlated with every combination of properties. 2, some of these objects, among them fictional objects, have no existence whatsoever. And 3, although they do not exist, they in some sense have the properties with which they are correlated, right? So, what kind of sense are we to make of them? Well, as Thomasson points out on page 150 in the left-hand margin, there are important differences between my artifactual theory and any such Meinongian theory of fiction. First, the theories differ with respect to where they apply the word exist. I am willing to claim that fictional characters exist. The Meinongian grants them no existence whatsoever. But because the Meinongian famously maintains that there are such objects, that we can think of them, refer to them, and so on, this difference is largely linguistic. A deeper difference, she notes, between the theories regards how many objects they say there are. Unlike the Meinongian, I do not employ any kind of comprehension principle, and so do not claim that there is an infinite, ever-present range of non-existent or abstract objects. In the artifactual theory, the only fictional objects there are those that are created, right? Going on a little bit more, she notes, these fictional entities can be said to make these objects, authors that is, can be said to make these objects fictional, for an abstract or non-existent object does not become fictional until it is written about, right? So, in short, for Thomasson then, a fictional entity does have an existence, but not an existence in what she calls the concrete or substratum world of ordinary medium-sized objects, as metaphysicians like to say, but rather they exist as entities in literary works, which themselves, as we've seen, right, they need their existence needs an account, right, and they ultimately stem back to the imaginings, the mind of an author, right, and they're not necessarily worse aware for being linguistic objects, right? As we can see, they still have some kind of a paradoxical impact on us insofar as they're able to elicit emotions and teach lessons. So we'll be examining these themes in detail in the weeks to come.